Last week, IBM and Red Hat announced they are committing $5 billion to secure open source software. $5 billion. A massive commitment from two industry giants. Now, on the surface, that sounds like great news. Open source powers more than 90% of Fortune 500 companies. It runs your servers, your containers, your CI/CD pipelines. If someone is putting serious money into securing it, that should be a good thing. But the Linux and open source community is not celebrating. And after spending the last few days reading through the announcement, the technical details, and the community reaction, I think I understand why. Here's what we are going to cover in this video. What is Project Lightwell and what does it actually do? Why is Anthropic's AI model finding nearly 4,000 critical vulnerabilities in open source the real story behind this announcement? Is IBM building a security layer or a gatekeeper? What does this mean for your Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Fedora servers in practice? And after 25 years of watching vendors promise to fix open source security, is this one different? Let's dive into the details and see what this commitment really means for you. So let's start with the basics. What is Project Lightwell? IBM and Red Hat announced it on May 28, 2026. The commitment is $5 billion, backed by a team of more than 20,000 engineers. And it is built around what they are calling a trusted enterprise clearinghouse for open source security. That word, clearinghouse, is doing a lot of work in this announcement, so let's unpack it. The model works in 3 steps. First, enterprises can report sensitive security vulnerabilities they find in their software. Not just Red Hat products, but any open source code they are running to this clearinghouse. That reporting happens in a controlled, private framework before anything goes public. Second, IBM and Red Hat's engineering team, augmented by AI, develops and validates a patch. Not just a community patch that may or may not be safe for production. A patch that has been tested against enterprise environments. Third, that validated fix gets sent back upstream to the open source community so the project maintainers can include it in the official codebase. And the scope here is genuinely broad. IBM says they currently use more than 62,000 open source packages, with deep expertise in over 10,000 of them. Project Lightwell extends their patching and lifecycle management beyond their traditional Red Hat product boundaries to independent libraries, language toolchains, AI frameworks, and data streaming platforms. So in plain terms, if you are an enterprise running a piece of open source software that is not officially part of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and you find a critical vulnerability in it, Project Lightwell is supposed to be the place you go to get it fixed, validated, and safely deployed. That is the pitch. And on paper, it is a strong one. But before we get to the questions this raises, let's talk about why this announcement happened right now. Because the timing is not a coincidence. Here is a number that is driving everything. 3,900. That is the number of high or critical severity vulnerabilities that Anthropic's Mythos preview model found in open source software by itself in a relatively short period of time. Let that sink in for a moment. A skilled human security researcher might find 10 to 50 significant vulnerabilities in a year of dedicated work. An AI model can find nearly 4,000 in the same software ecosystem in a fraction of that time. And here is the part that should concern every sysadmin watching this. If Anthropic's AI can find those vulnerabilities, so can an attacker's AI. The same technology that accelerates defense also accelerates offense. This is the core problem Project Lightwell is trying to solve. The gap between when a vulnerability is discovered or exploited and when a validated patch actually reaches production environments has always been too wide. AI is making that gap more dangerous, not smaller. IBM references 2 other AI security initiatives in their announcement. Anthropic's Project Glasswing and OpenAI's Trusted Access for Cyber. What is interesting is that IBM is not competing with those programs. They are consuming the outputs of those AI models as inputs to the Lightwell pipeline. So the architecture is, frontier AI finds the bugs at scale. IBM's 20,000 engineers validate and fix them. And enterprises receive production-ready patches through a commercial subscription. That is actually a coherent model. And it explains why the early adopters are all financial institutions. Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Visa, MasterCard, and others. These are organizations that face the strictest regulatory requirements around software security. And they have the budget to pay for a commercial service that solves this problem at scale. So the problem is real, the technology is real, the early adopters are serious. So why is the open source community skeptical? The concern the community is raising is not that IBM is doing something obviously wrong. It is more subtle than that. The question is, What happens when the entity that validates your patches, coordinates your vulnerability disclosures, and manages your security lifecycle is also a commercial vendor with a subscription model? Think about it from a practical standpoint. Project Lightwell covers the packages IBM and Red Hat decide to cover. The announcement does not specify what happens to a critical vulnerability in a package that is outside their scope. It does not specify patch delivery SLAs. It does not specify how zero-day disclosures are handled when the enterprise that found the vulnerability is a paying customer and the upstream maintainer is not. IBM is very clear that they are not replacing upstream maintainers. They say the clearinghouse is designed to strengthen upstream communities, not bypass them. And to their credit, the model does include upstream disclosure, and fixes are supposed to flow back to the open source projects. But here is the tension. The history of enterprise open source is full of examples where commercial interests and community interests diverged. Red Hat's decision to restrict access to RHEL source code in 2023 is the most recent and most visible example. That decision was commercially rational, it was also deeply unpopular with the community, and it directly led to the creation of forks like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux. The community is not being paranoid. They are pattern matching against recent history. And there's a second concern that is more structural. If Project Lightwell succeeds, if it becomes the de facto standard for enterprise open source security, then IBM and Red Hat gain significant influence over the security posture of a huge portion of the software that runs the internet. That is a lot of leverage for one commercial entity. Now, I want to be fair here. IBM's announcement explicitly says they are not trying to build a gatekeeper. And the NAND research analysis I read makes a strong case that IBM's upstream contribution history and engineering skill actually give them credibility with open source communities in a way that a pure play security vendor would not have. But credibility and accountability are different things. And right now, the accountability mechanisms for Project Lightwell are not clearly defined. So let's get practical. You are a sysadmin. You are running Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or Fedora, or a mix of both. What does Project Lightwell actually mean for your day-to-day work? Chapter 5. What this means for your RHEL and Fedora servers. Let's separate the two audiences here, because the impact is quite different depending on what you are running. If you are running Red Hat Enterprise Linux in production, whether that is on-premises, in a hybrid cloud, or on OpenShift, Project Lightwell is essentially an extension of the support model you already have. Red Hat already provides lifecycle management, validated patches, and security advisories for RHEL. What changes is the scope. Project Lightwell extends that coverage to open source components that are not officially part of the RHEL platform. So if you are running a Java application that depends on a third-party library that is not bundled with RHEL, and that library has a critical CVE, historically, you would have been on your own to evaluate and deploy a community patch. With Project Lightwell, IBM is saying that you can report that vulnerability to the clearinghouse and receive a validated, production-tested fix. That is genuinely useful. Enterprise security teams spend enormous amounts of time evaluating whether community patches are safe to deploy. Anything that reduces that evaluation burden and shortens the time from disclosure to deployment has real operational value. Anything that reduces that evaluation burden and shortens the time from disclosure to deployment has real operational value. For Fedora users, the picture is more indirect. Fedora is the upstream testing ground for RHEL. Project Lightwell fixes flow upstream. Fedora benefits indirectly. Features and fixes that land in Fedora eventually make their way into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. If Project Lightwell's validated patches are being contributed upstream, Fedora users will benefit from that work, but through the normal upstream contribution process rather than through a commercial subscription. What Fedora users will not get is the commercial subscription layer, the private vulnerability reporting, the SLA-backed patch delivery, the enterprise validation. That is explicitly the paid tier. Now, one question I have not seen answered in the announcement is pricing. IBM has not disclosed what a Project Lightwell subscription costs. Given that the early adopters are all major financial institutions, I would not expect this to be cheap. Whether it is accessible to mid-market enterprises or smaller organizations is an open question. And there's one more angle here that I think is underreported, and it is the one I find most interesting from a sysadmin perspective. It is the question of what this means for your patching workflow. Not in theory, in practice, on a Tuesday morning when a new CVE drops. Let me walk you through what the current patching reality looks like for most enterprise sysadmins, and then what Project Lightwell is supposed to change. Right now, when a critical CVE drops for a piece of open source software you are running, here is what typically happens. You get an alert. from your vulnerability scanner, from a security mailing list, or a colleague who saw it on Hacker News. You go to the project's GitHub or issue tracker. You find a patch or a workaround or a note that says fixes in progress. You evaluate whether that patch is safe to apply to your specific environment. You test it in staging, you deploy it to production. And somewhere in that process, you spend hours, sometimes days, doing work that is not directly related to your actual job. That is the problem Project Lightwell is targeting. The validation and testing steps, the ones that consume the most time, are exactly what IBM is offering to do at scale with AI assistance and with production-grade testing. In theory, if you are a Project Lightwell subscriber and a critical CVE drops, you report it to the clearinghouse and receive a validated patch tested against enterprise environments. You skip the evaluation step, you go straight to testing and deployment. That is a meaningful reduction in operational burden. For large enterprises, that saving translates directly into reduced exposure windows. The period between when a vulnerability is known and when it's patched in production. By the way, I just pulled up our channel analytics. And it turns out about 82% of you watching right now are not subscribed yet. If you have been finding these useful, hitting that subscribe button is the best free way to support. Now, back to Project Lightwell, because there is an historical pattern here. One I have seen play out in 25 years of working in IT. I have been working in IT since the late 90s. And in that time, I have watched a lot of vendors make a lot of promises about securing open source software. Some of those promises delivered real value. Others were marketing exercises that looked impressive at announcement time and quietly faded. And a few turned into something the community did not expect and did not particularly want. Heartbleed in 2014 exposed something uncomfortable. That critical open source infrastructure, OpenSSL, was being maintained by a tiny team, with almost no funding, while billions of dollars of commercial value depended on it. The response was the Core Infrastructure Initiative. It helped. But it took a catastrophic vulnerability to make it happen. Log4Shell in 2021 was the same pattern at a larger scale. A critical vulnerability in a widely used Java logging library, maintained by volunteers, became one of the most exploited vulnerabilities in recent history. The response was a combination of government pressure and corporate funding commitments. The pattern is, a crisis reveals a structural weakness. Corporate and government actors respond with funding commitments. Some deliver real value. Others deliver press releases. Now here is what is different about Project Lightwell. And I want to be fair here because I think it is genuinely more serious than most. The technical details are specific. The initial focus is Java and Maven, backporting fixes to the exact dependency versions enterprises are already running, using configuration manifests like pom.xml without requiring access to source code. That is a real engineering problem with a real engineering solution. The plan to expand to PyPI, NPM, and Go is a credible roadmap. Red Hat CPO Ashish Padani said they have already had an onslaught of incoming requests since the announcement. That is not a press release metric. That is a demand signal. And David Shipley from Boseron Security made a point that I think cuts to the heart of it. The days of trillions in wealth depending on volunteers ended violently with Mythos. The bill has come due for open source. Someone has to pay it. The question is not whether enterprises should pay for open source security. They absolutely should. The question is whether IBM and Red Hat are the right entity to collect that payment and what the terms of that arrangement look like for the broader community. Let me walk you through the most important unanswered question in the entire announcement. The Project Lightwell announcement is detailed in some areas and completely silent in others. And the areas where it is silent are exactly the ones that matter most for sysadmins and open source advocates. Question 1. What does it cost? IBM has not disclosed pricing. The early adopters are all major financial institutions. Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Visa. These are organizations with security budgets that most companies cannot match. Whether Project Lightwell is accessible to a mid-market company, a government agency, or a university running open source infrastructure, we do not know. Question 2. What is the coverage scope? IBM says they cover more than 62,000 packages. But the announcement does not specify what happens when a critical vulnerability is found in a package outside their coverage. Do you get a not in scope response? Is there a process to request coverage? The boundaries of the clearinghouse are undefined. Question 3. How are zero-day disclosures handled? This is the one I find most interesting from a security standpoint. If a paying enterprise customer discovers a zero-day vulnerability in a widely used open source library, they report it to the clearinghouse. IBM validates and patches it. Then what? How long before it goes upstream? Who decides the disclosure timeline? Is there a coordinated disclosure policy? The announcement mentions a secure intermediary model, but does not define the mechanics. Question 4. What are the governance mechanisms? Project Lightwell is a commercial subscription service run by IBM and Red Hat.
There's no mention of an independent governance board, a community advisory panel, or any external oversight mechanism.
The decisions about what gets covered, what gets patched, and when fixes go upstream are made by IBM and Red Hat. Now, to be clear, IBM is not obligated to answer all of these questions in a launch announcement. These are design phase details that will be worked out as the project matures. But they are the questions that will determine when a Project Lightwell is a genuine public good for the open source ecosystem or a commercial service that happens to benefit open source as a side effect. The test is not the announcement. It is what happens in year 3. And that brings me to the comparison I think is most instructive here. Not with other security vendors, but with what IBM and Red Hat themselves did 3 years ago. In June 2023, Red Hat announced that they were restricting access to RHEL source code. Previously, anyone could access the full source through CentralStream. After the change, only paying RHEL subscribers and partners could access it. The community reaction was swift and negative. The Alma Linux and Rocky Linux projects, which had been built specifically to provide a free, community-supported, RHEL-compatible distribution, had to adapt their build processes. The Open ELA initiative was formed as a direct response. Linus Torvalds commented publicly. The debate about whether Red Hat had violated the spirit of the GPL ran for months. Red Hat's position was that the change was commercially necessary and legally compliant. And they were right on both counts. The GPL does not require you to distribute source code to everyone. Only to the people you distribute binaries to. Red Hat was within their rights. But the community's concern was not primarily legal. It was about trust. About whether a company that had built its business on open source was still a reliable steward of the ecosystem it depended on. That tension between commercial rationality and community trust is exactly what Project Lightwell will face. IBM and Red Hat are asking enterprises to trust them as the security clearinghouse for open source software. They are asking upstream maintainers to trust that validated fixes will flow back to the community in a timely and transparent way. They are asking the broader ecosystem to trust that a commercial subscription model will not over time create incentives that conflict with the interest of the open source projects it depends on. That trust has to be earned. And right now, the 2023 RHEL source restriction is the most recent data point the community has for how IBM and Red Hat behave when commercial and community interests diverge. That does not mean Project Lightwell will follow the same path. It means the community is watching, and they are right to watch carefully. So let me give you my honest assessment of where this lands. After 25 years in IT, here's where I land on Project Lightwell. The problem it is trying to solve is real. The open source security debt is enormous, and it is getting worse faster than the community can address it. AI-accelerated vulnerability discovery has fundamentally changed the threat landscape. The gap between when a vulnerability is found and when it is patched in production is too wide, and it is costing enterprises real money and real risk. The technical approach is credible. Backporting fixes to exact dependency versions, working from pom.xml manifests, starting with Java and Maven, before expanding to other ecosystems. That is a sensible, pragmatic engineering plan. It is not a press release, it is a specific technical commitment. The scale of the investment is serious. $5 billion and 20,000 engineers is not a marketing budget. IBM is betting real money that this model works. But here's what I am watching for. First, pricing transparency. If Project Lightwell is only accessible to Wall Street banks, it is not solving the open source security problem. It is solving the enterprise security problem for the richest enterprises. That is a different thing. Second, coverage scope definition. The announcement is deliberately vague about what is and is not covered. When the first major vulnerability falls outside the clearinghouse's scope, how IBM and Red Hat handle that moment will tell us a lot about what this project actually is. Third, governance. A commercial clearinghouse for open source security run by a single vendor with no independent oversight is a structural risk, even if that vendor has good intentions. I would like to see an independent advisory board, transparent disclosure policies, and community representation in coverage decisions. If those three things materialize over the next 12 to 18 months, Project Lightwell could genuinely be one of the most important developments in enterprise open source security in a decade. If they do not, if pricing stays opaque, coverage stays undefined, and governance stays entirely internal, then the community's skepticism will have been justified. I am cautiously optimistic. but I am keeping my eyes open. Now, what does this mean for you practically right now? Let me give you 3 concrete things you can do this week. Regardless of whether you end up subscribing to Project Lightwell, this announcement should prompt 3 concrete actions for anyone running Linux servers in production. Action 1. Audit your open source dependency footprint. Most organizations do not have a complete picture of every open source package running in their production environment. If you do not know what you are running, you cannot know what is vulnerable. Tools like Sift, Gripe, or Trivy can generate a software bill of materials, an SBOM, for your containers and systems. If you are not already doing this, start now. Project Lightwell or no Project Lightwell, this is foundational. Action 2. Review your patch validation process. The core value proposition of Project Lightwell is reducing the time between vulnerability disclosure and validated patch deployment. Even without a commercial subscription, you can improve this internally. Define a clear process for how your team evaluates community patches before deploying them. Document your testing criteria. Set internal SLAs for critical CVE response. The goal is to shrink that exposure window, whatever tools you use to do it. Action 3. Follow Project Lightwell's progress, but do not wait for it. Project Lightwell is in design phase with early adopters. It will be months, possibly more than a year, before it is available as a general commercial subscription. The vulnerabilities in your software supply chain are not waiting. Keep your current patching processes running, keep your scanners updated. Treat Project Lightwell as a future option to evaluate, not a reason to defer action today. The open source security landscape is changing faster than most organizations can track. Project Lightwell is one response to that change. But the fundamentals of good security practice, know what you are running, patch it promptly, test before you deploy, those do not change, regardless of what IBM announces. Let me wrap this up with the bottom line. Let me bring this together. Project Lightwell is IBM and Red Hat's $5 billion answer to a real and growing problem. The open source software that runs the world's enterprise infrastructure is increasingly vulnerable. And the community structures that maintain it were not built to operate at the scale and speed that AI-driven threat discovery now requires. The technical approach is specific and credible. The investment is serious. The early adopters are real. And the problem it is addressing, the gap between vulnerability discovery and validated patch deployment, is one that every sysadmin running Linux in production has felt directly. But the community skepticism is also legitimate. The questions around pricing, coverage scope, and governance are not answered. The 2023 RHEL source restriction is recent history, and a commercial clearinghouse model, however well-intentioned, creates structural dependencies that the open source ecosystem has historically been cautious about. My honest read, this is worth watching closely. If IBM and Red Hat deliver on the transparency and governance side, not just the engineering side, Project Lightwell could be genuinely transformative for enterprise open source security. If they do not, it will be another case study in the tension between commercial open source and community open source. Either way, the fact that this announcement exists tells you something important about where enterprise open source security is heading. The days of assuming that someone else is handling the vulnerabilities in your software supply chain are over. If you found this useful, I would genuinely appreciate a like on the video. It helps the algorithm understand that this kind of deep dive content is worth recommending to more people. And if you want to make sure you catch the next one, hit subscribe and the notification. You can also sign up for the newsletter at tondoeslinux.com/subscribe. I send out a weekly roundup of the most important Linux and open source news, with no fluff and no clickbait. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a pseudo user or get root access. It generally makes a difference and helps keep this kind of content coming. I will be keeping a close eye on Project Lightwell as it moves from design phase to general availability. When there is something concrete to report, pricing, coverage details, governance structure, I will cover it here.